not that representative, but I will try to do my best. Give me a problem, I will solve it. Give me an audience, and I'm clueless. So take this into account.
Which reminds me, you know that there's been research, and it seems that more people fear of speaking to audience than death.
I know.
So I think it was Seinfeld who said that most people would prefer in their funeral to be the guy inside the casket than the guy giving the obituary.
Yeah.
But I
That was a really nice intro. So nothing can happen anymore.
Anyway, Shachar already introduces me, but I'm Dr. Haloani. I'm the CTO of COTI. And as we said, I'm going to overview and drill down a bit into the technology of the COTI network, give you some idea on the type of component we have in the network and the roles, and some of the key innovations we are presenting in our AlphaNet, which was already released a week ago. Does it work? Okay. Manual. So, again, Shachar already talked about it.
Sorry, man.
You're doing great.
Easy. I planned it, by the way.
say by the
So Shachar already talked about what are the industry shortcomings that we are trying to solve. In most platforms, there are many challenges, a number of challenges, which deter the adoption of cryptocurrency into mainstream use. Most of you talked about it already. It's trust, it's privacy, it's stability, it's scalability, and it's the high transaction cost. All of it together is being resolved in a way within the COTI infrastructure. The way that we do it is the DAG-based infrastructure based on the trust chain protocol. This provides us an offer and high scalability together with a trust, privacy, and stablecoin framework. To better understand the component in the system, I will just overview briefly again. We can talk about it later. You can ask me whatever you want. But basically, there are 4 types of nodes in the COTI system. The first type of node is the full node, as we talked about. This is the gateway for any client interaction in the system. The full nodes are responsible for attaching a transaction to the DAG, executing them, validating them, propagating them to the network, also executing the proof of trust, and also collecting the network fees. I mean, they have a lot of roles, but they are not the most important node in the system. Another important type of node that we do have in the system is called the DSP node, the double spending prevention, which Shachar already mentioned. This is a protection layer for us, and this is a highly trusted node. Not everybody can run a DSP node. You need to be a highly trusted user in the system to be upgraded for a DSP node. So a DSP node is basically a handful of highly trusted nodes, as I said, which have one role in the system to reach consensus on account balance and also on data integrity. Another type of important node for us is, of course, the trust core node. This is the node which is responsible also to adding trust to our network, but also to calculate and any participant and even node trust score in the system. I mean, this is going to everything is going to be based on the decision, on the trust is going to be propagated from this node. And the last type of node is the history node, which is responsible for basically, as it said, maintaining the full history of transaction of the COTI ledger. This is needed because we don't want a full node, for example, to hold all the history of the transaction. We just want him to hold the snapshot, so it will be easier to run full node and operate them. And other components, as you said, currently they are centralized, but it's not the aim. Let's say in the long run, they are going to be replaced and be called node in a way. But these are the KYC node, which is responsible for the onboarding process and KYC and AML verification process. And we also have a zero spend server, which is responsible for releasing any idle transaction within the network. Pause for a second.
Is there a difference between a node and a server? Or is it the same word?
It's just a symbolic and a very, very important difference. One is centralized, a node is decentralized. That's the separation for us. And we want to shift every server in the system to be a node eventually. And if we try to illustrate all of it, it looks something like that. As you said, every interaction in the system starts with an onboarding process, followed by an initial trust score being created for the user. This will enable him to create his seed in the system and then connect to the COTI wallet and start to transact, basically. All transactions in the network are monitored by the DSP nodes and the trust score nodes, and each transaction is actually not propagated to all network. They are propagated in clusters and within its domain. I will elaborate about that later. So moving forward to the AlphaNet real innovations, as we call it, and stuff that we think that first we invented, maybe not, but why not say that? Anyway, the first one is the proof of trust. This is something, again, for us, trust is the major factor in the system. So we don't want to call the consensus plus the proof of work. We want to call it proof of trust because it provides both and actually address two things that are very important in the system: stability and also controlling the incentive for participants in the network, and also actually preventing and safeguarding the system from any spamming and DDoS attack. I mean, all of that is wrapped in one thing called a proof of trust, which is, if I summarize it very briefly, it is a new way to reach consensus between transaction parties in a database structure based on trust, in our case. Another problem, as I said, that the proof of trust is able to solve is the spamming, safeguarding the system from spamming and balancing the incentive, which are not really exist in other platforms. The way that it's being done is that we actually, proof of trust is combining different hashing algorithm operating in a chain fashion, selected randomly, as we said before, based on several factors. The major one are the trust score, the amount of the transaction, and the network difficulty level. Another important and unique aspect in our system is the DSP node clusters. As I said, in most systems, it is required that all nodes will be strongly connected in order to reach consensus on transaction. Whereas in our case, DSP nodes are geographically distributed into clusters. All nodes in a cluster are strongly connected, but a cross-cluster synchronization protocol is implemented, meaning we don't need all transactions to be propagated to all the network to reach consensus, which makes us, in a way, more scale. All transactions in a system at least require a signature of DSP node, at least one, but basically the consensus is a lot more than one in a cluster to be considered fully confirmed. And also, any double spending attack being done is identified in real time. We are able to identify it, flag it, and block it.
How?
How do we do it? It's a combination of the consensus. As I said, the cluster DSP signature is required. You need to get the consensus of the DSP nodes in a cluster. Let's say you have 3. 2 of them need to say that this transaction is the correct transaction. And if you have a double spend transaction, you're going to have it on a different node, and then it's going to be blocked because 2 are saying this is the real transaction, and 1 is saying this is not the real transaction. So one of them is going to be flagged as double spend. This is very minimizing the idea, but just to make it clear. Another important layer in the COTI network is the ability to monitor not just double spend attack, but also bad players in the network. And when I say bad players, these are not participants, these are actual nodes. Full node operator also can be bad players in the system, trying to propagate, let's say, bad transaction into the system. So in most systems, you don't have the ability to control, at least in an efficient way, to control this type of attacks and to identify this type of user. So in COTI, monitoring is done by assigning trust score also to nodes. Meaning, as always, you're gonna have nodes trust score, which is calculated in a similar fashion that we are doing it for user, but with different parameter metrics. The parameter metrics are not as the same as user. They're going to be transaction frequency flow, transaction frequency propagation, and stuff which requires load into the system. And the more work a node does for the system, the greater its trust score is going to be. I mean, if you are aged in the system, your trust is gaining. If you handle a lot of transactions correctly and honestly, you're going to be gaining your trust score, and by that, getting more transaction getting approved through your system, through your cluster, for example. Awesome. And adding to all that, this is something that, again, Shachaf already talked about, but this is the arbitration process. I'm not going to get too much into it, but at the bottom line, there is no way currently, not a good way, to protect buyer and seller from any dispute on transaction. We are providing this way in a decentralized collective of highly trusted users, screened, selected, which are able to vote and rule on dispute. The arbitration, similar in a way to the KYC itself, is an application layer. It's not really as part of the infrastructure, and it's not mandatory. I mean, if you are forking the system, again, arbitration is not a mandatory layer for the system to work properly. So you can choose either to opt in or to opt out of it for your own use case and your own needs. But the way that it works, as I said, is a decentralized application built atop the COTI infrastructure. It relies on game theoretic incentives for juror to rule cases honestly. Disputes are resolved by selecting arbitration jury, as I said, from a highly trusted pool, a large pool that we already have, and they are going to be selected randomly, so they are not going to be able to bias or bias the system. So very, very roughly, these are the key innovations in the alpha innovation. But again, as we already talked about, I would like to also present some of the key innovations in our testnet, which is actually around the corner. This is due for December, so it's not a lot of time to release this major release as well. And I'm just going to drill down into three of the major concepts that we are adding. One of them is the multi-DAG. We talked about is the ability to be able to not be bounded. COTI won't be bounded by the multi-DAG anymore. I mean, we will be able to run more than one DAG in parallel, and by that be able to deploy different tokens into the system and also smart contract and add them to the platform. We are going to support also smart contract, as we said, similar to Ethereum. It's going to be a decentralized on-chain smart contracts on that, which again, this is something which does not exist, so it's first of its kind. And we are going to provide a framework for stablecoin, meaning a framework for handling and issuing stablecoin. So the concept of multi-DAG together with smart contract and the ability to and the possibility of multiple Genesis transactions will allow us to create a very high performing stablecoin and a framework for that. This is it from me. I guess you have a lot of questions, so attack.
Is the multi-DAG